Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me in this video to discuss a book. This book, to be precise, Reflections in the Water. I'll answer some of the questions that some writers have asked me. Now here comes the first question. Where does the idea of the book come from? It's an interesting one, because the beginning of the book, the first scene in the book, was actually the first scene of the first book I published, The Dressmaker's Parcels. The story of my mother's and my grandmother's family around World War II, and how my mother and my grandmother joined the resistance. That first scene was subsequently removed in later drafts and is not part of the Dressmaker's Parcels. And I was revising and what I've cut out, the scene that I cut out, to see if something could be worth a short story. And I reread that scene and said, "Oh, that's worth the book. Why don't I write about the very beginning of Rachele Modiano Mendes as a lawyer in Venice?" That's another good question. I could say that Rachele Modiano Mendes is the investigative lawyer, the center of a series of historical crime fiction. Actually, I think about two, one set before the war, which is Rachele Modiano Mendes, the early years, and one set after World War II, Rachele Modiano Mendes Investigates. The character is inspired by my grandmother, more than loosely inspired. She was a lawyer. She was one of the few lawyers practicing law in Italy in the 1920s, and she continued for quite many decades, taking early retirement, in her words, at the tender age of 88. It's not a faithful description of my grandmother. It's not exactly the kind of law my grandmother practiced, but the character is my grandmother, and her family is her family, including my mother. Is there a story behind the title? Oh yes, there is, but it's not the way it's in the title, in the book. I mean, my late grandmother, the inspiration for Rachele Modiano Mendes, whenever you were examining something or analyzing something or even reading the newspaper, she always told you to try to make sure you were not looking at the reflections in the water, because that would give you a false perspective. And in the book, it's a line that the Countess Pesaro de Bonfili, an art dealer, tells Rachele as a criteria to use when she looks at art. But in reality, I've used my grandmother's phrase about everything. If you're reading news, if you hear something, if you're analyzing something, make sure that you look at the real thing and not at the reflections in the water. What is fiction and what is inspired by real facts or real anecdotes? The crime story is fiction, complete fiction. The fake certificate of authenticity and the death of somebody, the journalist, the art critic that whose name is put in question, they're all fiction. What is true is the backstory, the story of the fixed characters, like the friendship between the Countess Pesaro de Bonfili and Rachele Modiano Mendes' mother-in-law, in other words, my great-grandmother, and we'll come to that when I answer the next question. What is absolutely true, and it's almost verbatim because I heard the story several times, was the magistrate that told my grandmother she had a masculine brain. The first time I heard the story was was about 40 years after it happened. And it was clear to me, even if I was around 8, that my grandmother might have forgiven the man, but she surely hadn't forgotten, because she was as annoyed telling the story as if it had happened 5 minutes earlier rather than 40 years earlier. What is the inspiration for Countess Pesaro de Bonfili? Haha, that's interesting because it's a character I really love. She's the merger of 3 individuals that really existed. My paternal grandmother had a friend who was basically her sister. She knew her they met in primary school, as it's between Fiamma and the Countess in the book. And they had brothers and they both longed for sister. And that's person number 1. Person number 2 is a friend of my maternal grandmother who was an art dealer. And person number 3 is a genuine countess, an actual childhood friend of my mother, a woman who could genuinely murder you with a nice sentence. She could say most wonderful thing to you, but you could tell from the voice and from the look that she was being sarcastic. And she was the one that was always immaculately turned out. Her husband was 18 years older, and probably he was the only one who saw her without makeup. Not even her children saw her without makeup. And she became a widow very early on in life, and when she was in her late 50s, she acquired, as one does, a partner, a lover. And when she died, the partner realized that her true age, because he thought she was 20 years younger. And his comment at the stone setting was amazing, like, and at the beginning I was afraid she might get pregnant. Well, at their beginning she was 58, and she had told him she wasn't 40 yet, and got away with it. So, that is and I merged these 3, the main feature of these 3 ladies into the Countess. This is a photo of the late Chita Riveira, and I included it in this video because, for me, she's the best representation of Countess Pesaro de Bonfili. Always immaculately turned out, not showing her age, and very witty and clever, maybe too clever sometimes. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. The next video will be about Villa Kalman's secret.